all ready? Good evening, and welcome to the 2018 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference and the Bill James Room presented by the Action Network. My name is Jill Randolph, and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. And it is my sincere pleasure to introduce our panel, The Right Stuff, Launching a Business in Sports. The panelists, who probably don't need any introduction, are as follows. We have Jason Robbins, CEO and co-founder of DraftKings. Maverick Carter, CEO of Spring Hill Entertainment and Uninterrupted. We have Alex Rodriguez, founder and CEO of A-Rod Corp. And Nate Silver, founder and editor-in-chief of 538. And our moderator, Michelle Steele, who is a studio anchor and reporter at ESPN. The panel will go for 40 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so using Twitter and the hashtag #RightStuff. And with that, I'll give it to Michelle.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jill.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you.
Good audience so far. I like what I see. So I'm so appreciative to be back at Sloan for another year. I've been coming to this conference for so long that Nate Silver, I think you might have still been with Baseball Prospectus, and I'm positive that you had like a burrito bracket or something that you were famous for and talking about. I mean, those were the days where you would run into Bill James and Michael Lewis in the hallway, so it's amazing to see this growth. We've got a phenomenal panel of literal and figurative heavy hitters right here. I know, you guys, that we are the only thing standing between you and a bar, so I'm gonna try to make it worth it. Well, these guys are gonna make it worth it for you today. Let's hit the ground running. I want everybody on this panel to kind of put on their investor hat, because that's something that everybody here has in common. Everybody's invested in their companies, everybody's invested in people, everybody's worn the pinstripes at one point or another. That's just Alex, I'm sorry.
He's got his pinstripes on today, too.
Yeah, and you're consistent, you're brand consistent, Alex. I like to see it. All of these guys have people come up to them and say, hey, Alex, Mav, Jason, Nate, I've got a great idea. But how do you differentiate that and a good business idea? So I'm going to start with the athlete first here. You've got the pinstripes on. So Alex, you get approached all the time. We had a hard time leaving the room. There are so many people that wanted to say hello. How do you differentiate between a good idea and a good business?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, the way we look at businesses is three things. We look at product, how good is the product? We look at the people running it. And is it a business that we can actually scale out domestically and internationally? So that's one way.
So you're sizing it up. What about you, Mav? You're someone who gets approached, I'm sure, quite a bit. How do you approach sizing up a business and whether it's the right opportunity for you?
That's a great question, because first off, you have to be able to understand, to your question, that there is the difference between a good idea and a good business. Sometimes something is a good idea or even solves a problem, but can you turn this into a good business is a separate question of is it a good idea. So I think, in looking at things, first off, for myself, it's, can I help? Is this a business that I can actually help? And is this something that I will be passionate about? Because I have not gotten to the point in my life where I'm a passive investor, where I'm just putting money in things and not paying attention or not helping the management, not helping the team. So I look at things, am I passionate about this? Will I help it? But I think understanding the difference between a good idea or something that will solve a problem and that's something that's scalable it's something that I learned by just going into experience and trying things and failing at things and understanding that sometimes you have the right idea, but you're too far ahead of where the world is, or you're thinking about things too broadly, too fast. I launched a business once that was a great idea, and I think eventually will be a business, but we went too broad, too fast. So as a business, it was wrong and it failed, but it was the right idea.
Jason, what about you? You're someone who has a startup. I don't know if I can even call it a startup anymore. It's so
I call it a startup.
Big one though, DraftKings. When did you realize that not only was this a good idea, but this was a viable business?
Well, first of all, when you started, you confused me. You said start with the athlete. I almost started talking. So please be more specific.
Oh, I apologize
No,
for
it's
that.
okay. It's okay. I think I looked at
We're gonna have to show your highlights later,
Yeah, you don't want to see me trying to play sports. So actually look at the same things when I'm investing in something as I did when I started DraftKings. And one of them, as Mav said, is do I know something about this? Can I help? But the other two things I look at, and these are the things I think are more important than anything, and you almost ignore everything else. One is, and this is the most important thing by far, how good is the person and the people running it? Are they great? Are they going to be successful? Are they people that have that it factor? Are they passionate? Are they going to be working 24 hours a day? Nothing more important than to make this success. That's the most important difference between successful and non-successful businesses. Second thing I look at is not actually the idea. As to Mav's point, sometimes the idea isn't a great idea, and also it changes a lot along the way. So I look more at the market. Are they going after a market that's big? And if you have a smart founder and founding team, and they're going after a big market, I'm going to bet that they're going to figure out how to tackle that market. And DraftKings was no different. If you look at the things that we were thinking and how we were going to approach the market when we started, it's totally different after we iterated for just a few months. I mean, totally different. But I was really confident in the team I was bringing together. I had incredible co-founders, and I thought the market we were going after was huge. So really the same calculus. And then it was something I was passionate about, and I felt our skill set was a good match for it.
How hard was it for you? I mean, when you think about the fantasy business, that seems like a gimme, right? For any investor, for any sports investor in particular. How hard was it for you guys to get financing out of the gate? Because clearly,
Really
you can't
hard.
be self-financed when you're talking about a company that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
I probably got told no to by at least 50, if not more people. And I mean, I just was trial and error. I had no thick skin about it. It didn't matter, just had to keep going, but it was a brutal fundraise. That first one, actually the second one, were really brutal, and then once the business got rolling, it was better. But I'd never done a startup before. I had no credibility. Somebody once said to me, you know what the easiest way to raise venture capital is? And I said, what? And they have a previously successful startup. Right? That doesn't really help me. Also helps if you're one of these guys and you're well known. But I didn't have any of those things, so I had to just go and trial and error, and finally got lucky. We found the right investor, this guy Ryan Moore, happened to be right at the right time. It was right before football started, and he was excited about his fantasy football lineup, so of course, or his roster, I should say. So, it was right timing, top of mind, and luckily for us, he backed us.
Let's talk a little bit more about those inflection points. Nate, I made a mention of the burrito bracket, but that was, that was a blog, that was a website that was pretty heavily trafficked, really well known about, in part thanks to Sloan. When did you decide it was the right time to sell, and what signal did you see that made you think, all right, I've built this as big as I could build this, and it's time to find a larger partner?
I mean, it was very cool to see 538 in its early stages grow at kind of this geometric rate, where I remember the first day you got 1,000 visitors on the site, which had just started as a hobby, and then 10,000, then 100,000, and 1 million in a day. So 7 years ago, roughly, I licensed 538 to the New York Times, and part of that was because I didn't want to run the business side anymore. I wanted to just concentrate on the quality of the journalism, which is a really important differentiator for us. And likewise at ESPN, it's not my job to sell ads. It's my job to run the newsroom instead. But as a result of the process that we're in right now, I'm kind of re-engaging with some of these questions, and they're kind of interesting. I think I've learned a few things about what works.
The process of
I'm now
selling
thinking
538.
I'm thinking about the process of looking through options with ESPN. I'm thinking about 538 as a business for the first time in 7 years, and I remember I kind of like these problems going back to the baseball prospectus days. But I think in sports media, the thing people got wrong for a long time was not putting enough emphasis on differentiation and quality. You had a lot of people doing very watered down, duplicative content and trying to trick the Facebook algorithm into basically giving people stuff they didn't really want or need, or that had no nutritional value. I am happy when Facebook tweaks its algorithm and doesn't give cheap traffic to anybody anymore, because we have earned a reputation over almost 10 years now by doing stuff that's high quality. It's definitely different. You might or might not like 538, but we definitely have a different point of view and a distinct point of view and kind of own our space. And so, it doesn't make it easy to like run a media business. It's kind of a tough business right now, but I think you have no shot. If you're like the third best at something, you have no shot to make it in the media business. If you kind of own a space though, then there's potential at least.
I think Nate's right. And I mean, what you're talking about is in the sports media, it became a lot of growth hacking. Literally, I met with kids who were in college, UCLA, other places, who just knew how to, literally they knew how to hack page views and followers on Facebook. And they would build pages, first name Oklahoma, last name Thunder, Oklahoma City Thunder, build it up, and then flip it over to a business page. They were just simply hacking it with bad content that they thought people wanted. But to Nate's point, I always believe, and what we do at Uninterrupted is quality and differentiation will always hold serve and eventually will win out. That's the bet that I made, the same bet that Nate's made.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring that up, Mav, because you are right now invested, the CEO, right, of Uninterrupted. You're also the CEO of Spring Hill Entertainment. When you think about making money in sports, particularly in sports media, you feel like the barriers to entry are so high because you feel like you do need to get into a deal with the NFL or the NBA and pay millions of dollars for those rights fees. So how do you make money in media? In sports media specifically, but without having those rights necessarily?
I think to Nate's point, again, you have to figure out, sports media is big, right? There's obviously ESPN, there's Fox, there's big people who are in the sports rights business. But I think sports media has also changed to where people care about what Jason's doing at DraftKings. That's a different type of media that people are going to care about as they're setting their lineups for baseball or golf or whatever. That's a different set of type of media than necessarily just the rights. Obviously, the rights and the games affect Jason's business because that's what drives DraftKings, but I think you have to figure out what's your point of differentiation. So our point of view is we work with the athletes to tell the stories that they truly care about and to show that they are more than an athlete. And in fact, our business tagline is I am more than an athlete. And last weekend, we did a piece with Kevin Durant and LeBron with a partnership with Uber, and it became this big thing because the woman on Fox attacked LeBron, but that is our tagline. I am more than an athlete. So athletes know our brand and know we're the place to come, that we are going to truly tell your story. We're not going to water it down. We're not going to cheapen it. We're also not going to tell an inauthentic story, and we're also not going to help you shill and sell products, or make an announcement. We're not a PR firm, but if you want to tell a story, we will do it in the highest quality, the best way, and I think we've proven that, and athletes know it. And that's what you have to do. Now, we're never going to be as big as ESPN, but I don't want to be. I want to Nate's point, create quality content with athletes and be different than what everyone else is doing.
And it feels like we've reached a point where athletes are owning their narrative a lot more than they ever did, and they're speaking out, obviously, a lot more than they ever did. Does that, I don't mean to phrase it necessarily in such a crass, like, oh, this is all about money way, but does that make good business sense too, when athletes sort of own their story and say, look, this is how I feel about a controversial topic like LeBron did?
Well, I can say personally, whether it's licensing or business or media and entertainment, it's really about owning your brand.
Yeah, it's not about playing the middle anymore.
Right. One of the things we've done with Jennifer and with my brand is we've gotten away from, really untangled ourselves from licensing deals and really into the world of equity and owning. Either we build it or we're a real partner. And Jason and I were talking about that a little bit today. And you take Jennifer, she's had over 15 different type of fragrances. One was called Glow. This one particular fragrance made over $1 billion. Now, her stake on that was so tiny, maybe 1 or 2% of the gross. So the idea is if you shift and you get out of that agreement and you get into an agreement and you build Glow 2 with another name and you build a $200 million company and you own the lion's share, that's a much better model and much better control of your business.
I would say, does it make business sense? It's in what we do at Uninterrupted and telling stories with athletes is not even about business or brand. It's about these an athlete, people talk about them as brand like A-Rod did, but they're also a human being who changes every single day. So if you're a brand, per se, if you're Nike, I started my career at Nike, or if you're, Nike's not a good example, another brand that really works, Colgate, and you put out a brand message or a brand ethos, and it's working, you're selling toothpaste, they'll never change the brand ethos or the brand statement. It'll just be what it is as long as people are buying the toothpaste and showing up. But a human being, you can't do that because a human just changes every single day, every moment. You're learning, you're changing, you're growing. You become a mother, you become a husband, a father, whatever. So it's about telling that story and taking people on that journey, whether it makes business sense or not. It's who you really are, and people eventually will either like it and get on board, or they won't, but you have to tell the story the right way.
Do you feel like an athlete can take ownership of their brand later in their career when they've already established themselves as an athlete and they can kind of go out and take more risks, more chances?
I would say it's not even about ownership of your brand. It's you have to tell the story that matters to you, that is really who you are. You can't bullshit people. You can't tell people you're this and you're not. You have to tell them exactly who you are, and you can only tell them who you are in that moment, and they have to understand that you're going to change and be different. I'm on this team now, but 5 years later, I feel different about this team, or this is what I'm into, or this is the music I'm listening to, this is the issues that I care about, or I'm not ready to talk about issues. I don't understand this issue or that, and take them on that journey. And that's what we look to do, is help athletes tell that story on that journey. That has nothing to do with how many home runs you hit or points you scored. It's just who you are as a human and telling that real, authentic human story.
I think we're seeing examples that, I think a lot of times, I'm not an athlete, but Aaron and I were talking about this earlier, saying when you're playing baseball, you are so focused on baseball because it is your life and it is every day you're playing. So I think it's hard a lot of times, and that's why you might see athletes who don't focus on that till later, but it's absolutely possible. A great example of that now is Joel Embiid, super early in his career, totally owning his brand, creating great content. People like him, and he's still doing great on the basketball court. So I think it's absolutely possible.
I know there was one entrepreneur who earlier today at Sloan had said that he's never seen so much opportunity in sports, specifically to start a business, to be an entrepreneur, to grow your business. Is that something that you guys are in this environment, you're in this space? Is that something that you've experienced as well?
I would say this. I mean, I think what Maverick and LeBron have built is an anomaly. I mean, it's really what they've done is historical. But I can speak about baseball because it's what I know best. It's a slippery slope, right? When you think about, there's no better ROI of your time, your energy, is to be laser focused at being the greatest baseball player you can be. So if you're trying to be a great entrepreneur, you're trying to be a great shortstop, and you're trying to be a great spokesman, it's too many distractions. And I took the approach, whether it was good or bad, to be laser focused on one singular thing. I worked better when I was really focused. Jason does a fantastic job of that today, and all these gentlemen up here do too.
Yeah, I think A-Rod's right. I mean, it's the best ROI for an athlete is to keep the main thing, to take a quote from Pat Riley. But I think in sports in general, there is a lot of opportunity, because of the technology that's available, that's also creating opportunity in the automobile industry, right? The technology that's available gives birth to Uber and to Lyft. And I think due to the technology that's available now, data companies are popping up in the sports business. Media companies like ours that couldn't exist when I first started 15 years ago because we couldn't afford, literally we couldn't get enough money to afford cameras and get things shot the way ESPN did, but now you can shoot. I think technology as a whole is creating opportunity in all of industries.
The main thing is the main thing, but if you, Mav, were hypothetically giving advice to a player who had off-the-court goals, how do you weigh that against what they want to do on the basketball court?
Well, I think, as you look at, and I was, listening to the president talk earlier about if he became the commissioner of basketball, and it's funny, I've had this conversation with Adam, the commissioner of basketball, and had it a lot, that the fact of the matter is if you're a basketball player, specifically since we're speaking about basketball, then basketball as a whole is the responsibility of the greater basketball community. So the NBA and Adam Silver, he's the commissioner of the NBA, and there's 30 teams that he has to care about and 400 and something odd players. But actually, as I've said to him, your responsibility is greater than that. Your responsibility is basketball as a whole, the sport as a whole. So that goes all the way down through college and into the youth, into AAU. And I think, as I was saying to Adam, these kids who start and playing AAU and they're 14, 15, well, guess what? They're your responsibility because in 2 or 3 years or 4 years, they're in your league. So it's your responsibility, and it's the NBA and it's the basketball community's responsibility as a whole to make sure that basketball is protected, because it's how we all eat, frankly. It's how we all have earned a living, and it goes for baseball and football the same. But I think now we're seeing, today with the story breaking on the NCAA and what's going on there, cleaning up basketball as a whole is the player's job and the NBA's job, the commissioner's job. Figuring out why is our youth system broke? Why aren't we figuring this out is all of our job that's involved in the basketball community. Because if something happens to basketball, we're all screwed.
One thing that Obama said that stuck with me was the number one piece of advice that he leaned the most on was making sure people around him told him the truth and told him when he was wrong. All of you have built the cultures of your organizations. How do you view that? How do you weigh that piece of advice, having truth tellers around you? And what other important qualities do you look for when you're looking to build a team around you?
I mean, that is probably the most important one, is that someone who can be straight with you, and you probably have the 2 people I trust most at 538. One tends to put a more optimistic spin on things and one more pessimistic, but they both are very straightforward and will tell you when you're fucking up. And that's super important.
And they use that language?
In our office, we probably, yeah.
Absolutely.
It's super important because
Yeah, you need someone to keep it real.
No, because as you gain more power and authority, it's not a natural type of relationship, right? You're used to you have your family and you have your friends, right? And they're usually pretty honest with you. You're not used to having employees who are scared to tell you when you're making a mistake. Doesn't mean people are always right. I think the best advice is I don't want someone who agrees with me 100% of the time, because that means they're either a sycophant or I'm not learning anything, right? I don't want someone who only agrees with me half the time, then we're misaligned, but someone in that 75% range. And so you're having an argument some of the time, and when you have that argument, that you sometimes can see that they have the right side of the argument. I mean, that's where I think the sweet spot is.
The thing I'd add to that too is, I think, and this is something a lot of people don't blend, they either say yes and don't challenge you, or they challenge you too much and it's hard to get aligned. Somebody who can challenge you, you have a debate, but then at the end of it, you walk out the door and you are marching down the same path. Everybody else in the company knows this is what we're doing. You are on the same page. And to be able to go through that process, but then once you're at the end of that process, recognize when the right time, even if you don't agree with the ultimate decision that was made, you got to get behind it and you got to represent to the company that this is the right thing to do and this is the thing we need to go out now and execute against. Very hard to find people that can do both of those. Usually you get one or the other.
And I would say also, when you're ultimately always seeking the truth, meaning even at my company, if I'm in a meeting or talking to someone, I will quickly admit when I don't know something. I will say to them something like, if someone walks in my office and says, what do you think about this? Should we do this or we do that? And I go, shit, I don't know. What do you think? That, I mean, literally, when you do that, when you're letting them, essentially letting your guard down that you don't know something as the leader of a company or the leader of a group, then they know, they become comfortable with telling you you're wrong or you're not thinking about this right or you missed this point. And at our company, that's what our culture is. It is a culture of everyone is seeking the absolute truth of I don't know this, I don't understand that, help me figure this out. And that's why we're all experts at something different. The people in production don't work with the people in athlete relations there, but they have to work together and they have to say, hey, I was trying to get this done, but I don't understand it. Can you help me understand it? And I encourage people, and the same, I'm sure Alex can tell you this about playing on a team every day. What you have to do, what you ultimately have to do every single day when you show up to work is, if I'm working with Jason and we're working together, I have to clearly be able to communicate to Jason, this is what I need from you in order for me to be successful, and Jason has to tell me what he needs from me to be successful, because we all want individual success. We all are obviously working for a company or working for a team or trying to win a World Series, but it's natural. Selfish is natural. It's like when people sometimes make selfish a bad word, I always say, there's a reason they tell you to put the mask on before helping others on the airplane. There's an absolute reason. So we all want individual success, but I have to clearly be able to communicate that to the people I work with. Here's what I need from you in order for me to be successful, and tell me what you need. And that's how you get a culture of people telling each other the truth.
Yeah, and I agree.
Yeah, I want to hear what you have to say about this, Alex, because you're working with people who know you from your baseball career. I mean, you could be working with someone who's literally a fan.
Sure.
So how do you make sure that that person is telling you the truth?
Yeah, that's a great question. I agree with Nate. I think it's the single most important decision you can make as a young entrepreneur is the board of advisors that you create around yourself. And I think it should be a diverse board, both in age, in gender, in expertise, and in the way they communicate, but definitely honest and very transparent. I think these are things that are going to be extremely important. Look, at the end of the day, if you think about leadership, women run my company. If you think about my CFO, my chief of staff, my managing director, are all leading my company. And not because they're the greatest, just because they're women, it's because they were the best people. And I think that's something that's been really good for me, because they have a different style and it works for our company.
Is there something that you guys learned over time that helped you become better at business today? Is there something that you thought, okay, well, gosh, I wish I knew that back then?
Yeah, there's something that I learned. I learned it from a gentleman who's a friend of mine who created and owns Purell. And very simply, again, I'll go back to what I was saying, a business that I failed in miserably. It was that going broad right away is not necessarily a win, meaning we launched a product, a consumer packaged good, and Target picked it up in Walgreens, and we were all cheering and high-fiving like it was the greatest thing that ever happened, and we were definitely going to win. But it's actually the fastest way to fail. And when he launched Purell, he literally launched it in 2 grocery stores in Akron, Ohio, and just stayed there until he got it right. And when he launched it, he had a person literally outside of the store squirting a sample in your hand, and then people would get it, go in and buy it. And when you think back to when Purell, to think that you can get clean hands without water wasn't a thought. So he then said, well, I can't scale this. I can't put a person outside of every store. I got to get rid of the person. He bought advertising just in Akron. Sales plummeted. And he's like, shit, what do I do? And he just kept working it till he figured out. He put a big bottle at the customer service stand, which is still the way they do it today. And that brought sales back up. And then once it took him 5 years to figure that out before he went to one other retailer outside of what he had. And I think, you know, in our business, we have a small audience, and we are very focused on making sure that audience knows exactly who we are, that we care about them, we listen to them, we talk back to them, and we don't necessarily need to go broad. We don't again, we're not trying to be ESPN right away. So I think that's one lesson that I learned that was key, is like perfect what you do on your level and at a pace that works for you before going broad. Because sometimes we all think, you know, you want to be bigger is better, more stores, and it's not necessarily.
Yeah, I think related to that is the importance of trial and error. Lots of ideas look great on a whiteboard or in a spreadsheet, but you learn like 10 or 100 times more when you actually have an audience who's testing it and a newsroom or a workforce that's doing it where they're actually real stakes. And so, you know, some of the best ideas we've had are things that we just kind of did as one-offs that became franchises. Some things we thought were going to be big parts of 538 went totally flat. You do, by the way, sometimes have to re-experiment with things because you get better over time. So maybe something that we did poorly in the first year of our business, maybe we would retry and revisit now. Maybe we're more mature now as a business, but like just try a bunch of stuff, collect data on how it's being received by the audience, repeat the stuff that works. I mean, that alone will...
Repeat the stuff that works.
Yeah, not to the point where you become boring. I mean, I also believe like, you do want to own your narrative even in media, and you want to be careful that you don't get typecast by other people. But at the same time, just knowing that here's a piece of content we can produce that we know will get a lot of traffic, and it's not going to be the best thing that we write that day, but we know that like that solves a certain problem, or just stupid things. Like we know that like on Fridays, it's nice to have a story that goes up early on Friday morning. It's preset and not off the news, because Fridays are slow news days in politics, or they used to be.
Not anymore.
Used to be in the pre-Trump era, right? But just learning a lot of things by rote over time that actually adds up, and you have quite a few skills and tools at your disposal.
I'm just curious about this, Nate, but you're like the data guy, you are the analytics guy, bar none. Have you ever ignored the data and made a business decision based on your gut?
I mean, to Obama's point, the data is just a tool. I mean, he's totally right about that, right? And one problem that you face in media is that there are some things you can measure and some things you can't measure, and sometimes the things you can't measure are more important. So it's very easy for us to measure in the short run how much traffic that we get.
Right.
But we really care about, in the long run, what's our reputation like, how big is our audience, how good is our work, and those things will condition the business success in the long term, but they're really hard to measure. And so it's important, like if you have one metric that's highly imperfect, sometimes you should not try and maximize that metric. You have to, like, although it's painful, try and feel out and estimate, again, through trial and error, kind of different measures of success. But yeah, don't make the mistake of thinking that because you can measure something imperfectly, that therefore you fit the solution to the imperfect metric. You'll have an imperfect model as a result.
Jason, this is not necessarily analytics based, but going back to the whole, is there something that I wish I knew back then that I know now? You've done this, you're still on that journey, right?
Where do I start?
What would it be? What would it be that the entrepreneurs in this audience can learn from and take away from?
I think that the most important thing is to always iterate, and that's actually pretty much exactly what I'm just pretty much stealing what the Maverick and Nate were saying a moment ago, but always iterate. We always talk about that. What got you to this point isn't necessarily going to be the thing that gets you to that next point. And don't be afraid to say, I failed, I need to try something else. Try, fail, iterate. Try, succeed, iterate. So that's something I think early on I didn't quite realize. We were very focused on this is how we need to do it. And the data came back and said, no, that's not working. And we quickly realized, all right, we got to do something different. We got to iterate. And it's no different than any company. I always talk about Amazon because it's amazing what they've turned online bookstore into. You start out selling online books, now they're selling web services to people, AI. I mean, you just iterate. You got to go with whatever is next and whatever you think is going to lead to the next bit of growth. And you have to not be afraid to say, this isn't working, I have to try something else.
I was talking to Alex backstage, actually. We were talking about, can you learn to be an entrepreneur? We had a little bit of a discussion about that. Can you learn not to be afraid to fail?
I think you can't learn not to be afraid to fail. You can learn to get more comfortable with it. As you do it more and you see the world doesn't explode and everything's fine, you move on to the next thing, you get more comfortable with it. But you can never be afraid. If you're afraid, you're naturally afraid, that's a tough thing to break. Part of being an entrepreneur is being a risk taker. If you don't have that in you naturally, it's really hard to succeed as an entrepreneur. Yeah. You have to take crazy risks. You have to put your business on the line multiple times along the way. I know that sounds crazy, but you have to do that.
And I think to Jason's point, you can't learn to be afraid to fail. You either have that or you don't. But what you can get comfortable with, or what you do learn, back to my word selfish, is when you do fail, you can go outside and guess what? Everybody's selfish. Nobody really gives a shit about your failure. They're worried about their own damn thing. When you fail, you automatically think, oh my goodness, the whole world's paying attention. They're like gonna be on me. When I walk out the door, everybody's gonna be on me. And you walk out the door after you fail and you go, no, actually everybody doesn't give a shit. They're just like going about their day, making sure they don't fail. Everybody's into their own thing. You can get comfortable and understand that that's how the world works.
And understanding that 8 out of 10 entrepreneurs are going to fail anyways. It's a failure game. In my sport, if you fail 7 out of 10 times, you go to Cooperstown. So it's really, it's the way it works.
You actually were quoted in an interview, Alex, where you said you had a PhD in failure.
Well, I mean, people don't realize this. I am 5th all time in the history of the game, 5th in strikeouts. That means only 4 people in the entire world that struck out more than me. The good news is Reggie Jackson's number 1, so that makes me feel better. But you get a PhD in failing, but you also get a master's in getting back up. And look, in the big leagues, everybody has talent. It's not just talent, it's grit and it's discipline. And those are the people that I want in a foxhole or in the Yankee clubhouse or in my company working with.
I mean, I do think, it's a cliche, but being true to yourself is the one thing that you can control. And usually if you're true to yourself, you're going to have a core group of people or a core audience that will kind of stick with you through thick and thin, and the rest of it will ebb and flow with the tides. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't try and think about that at all. But you don't want, at the times when I think I've made the biggest mistakes are things where I do things that aren't true to like core loyal 538 readers, and where people you're like, oh, you always are honest, but you always appreciate where we're coming from. If they begin to say, I don't think you're coming from the right place on this, then those people that you really have to listen to.
All right, I promised Jill that I would spend the last few minutes on questions, and we have quite a few. But I'm going to start with this one. What is the next disruptive trend that the sports industry needs to leverage? We clearly have a very important Supreme Court decision coming down on sports gambling, and I think that's going to be a huge market maker for sports. But let's just go down the line. What's the most disruptive trend that the sports industry needs to leverage?
I mean, you just took mine right there.
Yours. Matt?
Yeah, I think that's the most. Well, what I will say about that is I think that is also part of a larger change in how consumers are, how fans are consuming sports. I think that fans are looking at sports differently than they ever have before. They want to consume it in a more interactive way. They want the content curated and customized for them rather than sitting through just linear content. And they want things that are interesting, that are different, like what Mav's company's doing, that are changing how media represents athletes' stories and represents what's going on behind the game. And I think sports gambling is a part of that. People now want to be more interactive. They want to be more involved in sports. People like me who weren't good enough to play want to actually be a part of the game in some way. And I think that's a huge change in how consumers are interacting and using sports these days.
Yeah, we made a large bet on esports a few years ago. And if you think about it, can you believe that half the young men, millennials out there, more than half are playing esports and they're playing physical sports? And then we made a bet, well, why couldn't Hispanic and women also get into the space? So a few years ago, we got Jennifer to invest in esports and not only invest her capital or her brand. And I think this is a really interesting space as well.
And one of the few females investing in esports as well, I have to imagine.
Yeah, probably the first prominent one, yes.
This is a question for Alex. What observation or realization prompted you to create a business? You've certainly made plenty of money on the main thing in baseball. What made you decide, all right, I really want to dive into this head first?
Yeah, I think just like baseball, love the game. I think I love building from the ground up. I love curating teams. I've been in a clubhouse for 25 years, and I wanted to go from one clubhouse to the other clubhouse. And it's fun, and it's great to work together. And it's great to come together with people you respect. And it's funny when you go to board meetings, like the first hour and a half is how great the company's doing. And then you can just throw that crap away. And then you get into what are the 3 problems and how do we fix them? Like to me, getting really complicated problems and going around the table, I love what the president said. You get those people over here, what's your opinion, and get everyone to collaborate and have a completely transparent organization. And that is pretty complex, but when you figure it out, it's just as fun as winning a World Series.
Mav, this is a question for you. What's the best business model or pitch that you passed on, and why?
The best business model or pitch that I passed on.
He doesn't pass on anything good.
He's got them all right.
That is not true. Trying to think of something that was successful that I passed on. I mean,
I told you.
here's the good news. When you've had a few successes in your life, you throw out all the shit you missed and screwed up. And so the stuff that I did well on, keeps coming up. But I think, when you're in the business of investing, I'm an investor, I invest, but I also run my own business, you realize that sometimes you are going to pass on something, and you have to be okay with that. And the risk taker in me, the gambler in me, always wants to put a little action and take what they call in business a little schmuck insurance, just in case it turns into something great. But you have to be comfortable with, I may miss on something, but you can't, I'm also not going to spray and pray. I'm not just going to put money in this and over here and do this and do that and do everything because I'm taking a chance and I want it. I'm going to focus on the things that I know I can have an effect on and that my partners and I can actually help.
I'm just curious. This is not related necessarily to business pitches, but you've been in those meetings where there's negotiations on valuing LeBron, whether that's him as an endorser or cutting him into a deal, or as an athlete. If there were no salary cap in the NBA, how much is LeBron worth to a team?
Well, I don't happen to own a basketball team, but I think, the union does a fine job of negotiating for not just LeBron, but for 400 players. And I think, in business, in all business, if I'm negotiating with the board of my company for my salary or equity, and Jason, you too, and you get what you negotiate. That's just how it works. You never get what you deserve. There's a saying, you're going to get what you deserve. Well, I'm sure, a lot of people who work and do things are like, well, I hope I could get what I deserve, but you only get what you negotiate. And he works for a union, he works with a union, and the union does a fine job of negotiating for not just LeBron, but for all players. And I think, if I was an owner of a team, what would he be worth? A lot more than he gets paid if I owned the club.
The Knicks would pay him $100 million a year.
Yeah, by the way,
Nate,
Nate's probably done this on 538. What do the numbers say, Nate?
Well, so yeah, no, I mean,
Nate, can you be my agent too?
Exactly.
the best play, I mean, it's gotten a little bit better now with like the new max, and that makes it a little better, actually. But, peak LeBron was probably generating the equivalent of $65 million a year in like capped value, but if you uncap that cap, right, so you didn't have a cap at all. I mean, I think literally the Knicks would pay LeBron James $100 million a year, and it might not be a bad business decision for them.
Then he'd be like A-Rod.
He said a year, not for the career.
How do you, staying ahead of the way, okay, so how do you keep your brand and your products aside from doing, conferences like this, obviously, how do you stay ahead of the ways people consume media? I work for ESPN. This is a question that is probably talked about in our boardroom every day, twice on the weekends. And it's a huge question that people in the media business writ large are grappling with. How do you do that? How do you do that? People who are in the media business here. Nate, you're in the media business. How do you stay ahead of how people consume
I think
media?
It's tricky because I think I think the media industry is in a really interesting moment right now, where there's not a lot of consensus about what works and what doesn't. And to me, it's a great moment because it means there's not as much groupthink in the media as usual. So I worry about I think there were a lot of companies that tried to be the second or third best version of BuzzFeed, which has two problems. Number one, that means you're conceding that you're not the best version of BuzzFeed. Number two, BuzzFeed has a whole track record ahead of it and has experiences gone through the same problems that you're having now. They already solved. And number three, how much their business model works or doesn't is still an open question too. And so, I think if you're kind of chasing down and you're kind of in a boardroom saying, oh, someone else did that, and let's try and do a version of that, that's sometimes not only isn't the right answer, it can actually be actively the wrong answer. And so I think, again, figure out the core of what do we do really well, and then being ambitious and agnostic about how you distribute that, because you do have to find an audience, but I do think, don't compromise the core of what you do. Don't pivot to video, right? I mean, pivot to video is like a euphemism for, I'm going to die now as a media company, basically. So, concentrate on what you do.
Not naming names, obviously, but yeah.
No, but I can't think of very many companies that pivoted to video, and I know there are exceptions, I know many companies that invested in video initially is a different story. So BuzzFeed, for example, right? But I can't think of companies that pivoted to video and then were in a great place like 2 years later.
You know, to Maverick's point and content, I mean, content is really king today more than ever. And, you know, Maverick in a short time has become an expert in the space. But what I've learned recently is with Jennifer, she has, and what she's learned, and trying to capitalize on that now, and we should have a conversation at some point, is with her 150 million followers on social media. We just found out this week that over 75% of those are millennials. So by pressing that button, whether it's social media, it may be more powerful than her going on NBC or doing or the New York Times. So what she's working on is really, and what I'm working on is creating content that we can go direct to the consumer and get our message out.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for the panel. This was
Have a great drink.
amazing.
Great.